The Little Shop of Horrors might just be one of the most famous off-Broadway musicals ever made, as well as one of the best examples of camp done right in a story, as I went into further detail on in another video, which you can find a link in the description to. But despite the popularity of the musical and its 1986 film adaptation, many still don't know where the basis for this story actually came from, which is the 1960 movie of the same name by famed B director Roger Corman. And today, I'd like to dive into the history of Little Shop of Horrors and specifically how it came to be in the first place. And there will be spoilers for any and all movies I bring up ahead, so in case you don't want something ruined, you should probably keep your eyes peeled. This will be the only spoiler warning I'll be giving out. Okay, so right off the bat I would just like to stress, that, as I always do, that I am not a professional film historian, nor do I claim to know all the details on this topic inside and out. I am simply an average guy with a love of movies who's giving some information on a topic I happen to know a lot about. So please forgive me if I make any slight mistakes or oversights. And if you'd feel more comfortable getting into this topic with somebody more knowledgeable on the subject, please feel free to click off this video. Now, for those of you who are still wondering, yes, the 1960 Roger Corman directed version of Little Shop of Horrors was indeed the one and only basis for the famous play. In fact, a major reason Howard Ashman and Alan Menken chose that movie to adapt into a musical was because it was in the public domain, and thus they didn't have to pay any royalties or have to deal with a ton of red tape in order to use the story and characters. But while the 1960 version of The Little Shop of Horrors is an original story with no official source material of its own on paper, the movie actually borrowed quite heavily from another film made and released by Corman around the same time, to the point that the two are even frequently lumped together. Because Roger Corman was legendary for making movies on a small budget and never letting an opportunity to reuse something go to waste, be that actors, sets, and yes, even scripts whenever it was convenient for him. And pretty much all three of those applied to the original version of Little Shop of Horrors, as it shares a lot of the same props, actors, and story beats from the film A Bucket of Blood, which he made the previous year. Now, A Bucket of Blood is rather notable because it's one of Corman's more famous films and actually considered somewhat good. But the point is, both films do have a lot in common, and just to name a few, the leads in both are a nerd who wants respect, fame, and the love of a coworker, manages to get it completely by accident, then accidentally kills someone, and his attempts to hide his crime only bring him more success. And in addition to that, there's also an overbearing old lady figure who tries to run the main character's life, and their boss in both realizes what they're doing before anybody else but keeps their mouth shut because they can profit off of it. But perhaps the most interesting thing about both these movies is that they each have a very distinct style of humor that is seldom seen anywhere else. And it was that more than anything else that motivated Roger Corman to make both these movies, because throughout the 1950s, Corman found his biggest successes doing horror movies. He did make plenty of films in other genres, but the ones that got the most attention were usually his forays into horror. Though also keep in mind that this is only relatively speaking, as he made his movies so cheaply that it was almost impossible for them not to make money, and that the bigger profits from his horror movies weren't by the same margin that a conventional movie by a big studio would be. But I'm getting off topic here. The point is, by 1959, Corman was already pretty famous as a low-budget horror movie director, so the studio gave him $50,000 and told him to make another horror movie reusing sets from a previous film. But by that point, Corman was sick of horror and wanted to do something else, so screenwriter Charles Griffith came up with the idea of doing a black comedy that satirized both horror movies and the then widely popular beatnik culture. And while Corman was a little hesitant at first, he was ultimately talked into trying it out. So, borrowing somewhat from The Mystery in the Wax Museum and its remake House of Wax, A Bucket of Blood tells the story of a busboy at a beatnik cafe who desperately wants to be part of the IT crowd, but is looked over for being a hopeless geek. But after accidentally killing his landlady's cat and covering it with clay to conceal the crime, he's suddenly hailed for his genius as a sculptor. And then when he accidentally kills an undercover cop and similarly hides the body under clay, his popularity shoots through the roof, at which point he starts willingly murdering people in order to keep his newfound fame. And while it is still dark and somewhat unsettling, the movie also mixes in a ton of that aforementioned satire surrounding beatnik culture, as well as Roger Corman's own previous films, into the mix. And again, the results were actually considered pretty decent, to the point that it's still hailed as one of Corman's better movies even to this day. But when the movie came in ahead of schedule, Corman and Griffiths decided to shoot another movie while they still had access to the sets, as he was known to do whenever he got something done before a deadline, and Griffiths was able to sell him on doing another horror comedy that leaned even harder into satire. And thus, The Little Shop of Horrors was born. Borrowing heavily from A Bucket of Blood script, Griffith and Corman used black comedy, satire, Jewish humor, and spoof to create a film that used horror as a front for extremely odd, yet no less effective jokes, and the results led to both a cult following and the attention of a rising Ashman and Menken 20 years later, leading to the creation of a legendary stage show in the process. But as I also noted before, if you've seen both A Bucket of Blood and The Little Shop of Horrors, the influence of the former on the latter is extremely obvious, to the point that one could almost argue that it's the same movie with a different murder method and less beatniks. But another, more abstract difference is the tone, because while A Bucket of Blood is meant to be a comedy first, there is still quite a bit of genuine horror to be had, while The Little Shop of Horrors forgoes true horror almost entirely and is much more about comedy and camp. And while Corman did like the results of both these movies, their failure to turn a big profit in their original run caused him to only try his hand at the horror comedy subgenre one more time in Creature from the Haunted Sea, and when that similarly didn't do great, he opted to just go back to straight horror, where he would find his greatest successes of the 1960s. So like I already said, while the 1960 version of The Little Shop of Horrors was the inspiration behind the eventual play and was itself an original story written directly for the screen, it can't be overlooked just how much A Bucket of Blood influenced its production and in many ways was the direct result of it. Again, one could almost call it a remake of A Bucket of Blood. That's how similar the two really are. But as I also just got through saying, that doesn't mean Little Shop of Horrors is just a copy and paste version of A Bucket of Blood either, because its camp and style of comedy in particular are very unique to this film, and one can easily see how it influenced the feel of the play it would eventually inspire. Though even then, the play actually had to downplay the camp of the original film, with such things as a man who eats flowers, a dentist patient who loves pain, and yes, that is a young Jack Nicholson in his second film role ever, and Seymour's mother being taken out in order for it to be a little more serious, even if said patient was reinstated into the film version. Because while Howard Ashman wrote the play tongue-in-cheek and outright said it was supposed to be stupid, he still wanted it to have a degree of substance and the ability to be taken seriously when the situation called for it. To put it simply, the original version may borrow a lot from A Bucket of Blood, but Corman and Griffith still made sure that it was different enough to have something of its own to offer, and considering the results ended up being the basis for an extremely popular stage play, it wasn't bad stuff either. Though, for what it's worth, Roger Corman was said to have not only seen both the play and its movie adaptation, but also heavily approved of them at that. So even he was clearly willing to admit that they were better than his original movie. But when you shoot an entire film in just 2 days, which is still an industry record by the way, ensuring it's of the utmost quality is kind of off the table. Though considering what I just went over, it was still clearly better than it had any right to be, which is honestly a feat in and of itself considering its rushed production, and might even speak to the merits of A Bucket of Blood by proxy, considering how instrumental it similarly was in the creation of the original. But regardless of how one feels about any of these movies, as opinions on them tend to vary wildly due to their odd tones and subject matter, the point is that the play and 1986 movie version of Little Shop of Horrors have a much more complex history to them than most would suspect, and quite a weird one that most would agree fits right in with their overall strange styles at that. Alright, I think I've gone on about this for long enough, so now I'd like you to give me your thoughts. Do you think that the 1960 version of Little Shop of Horrors deserves more recognition for inspiring the stage play and 1986 movie of the same name, or do you believe it's better off in the past? And did you know that it in turn was heavily based off A Bucket of Blood from the previous year? Or had you never even heard of either of them before you watched this video? Whatever the case, please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And remember, you don't have to agree with any opinions expressed in this video if you don't want to. Comedy in particular can be very subjective, so if you think I was wrong about everything I said, that is completely fine. And thank you all for watching. I greatly appreciate it. And I hope to see you all next time.